Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on India's national television channel Doordarshan about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations and key strategic partnerships and relationships of India that go into making it a rising power. Viewers, this is a special episode where we are taking a close look at the global effects of India's rise. India's rise has been on the world horizon for quite some time, and there is a high level of expectation, anticipation, and also lots of questions about India's rise and what it will do to the world order at large, and that's what we are going to be discussing. I have with me to take us through a very interesting group of American students and a professor from NYU, New York University, one of the leading research and teaching universities of the United States. And the students come not only from the US but from Brazil and Colombia as well. Let me welcome our distinguished friends. Folks, it's great to have you in India. Welcome to India and to Indian diplomacy.
Thank you.
Okay, so viewers, let me kickstart this discussion about the global effects of India's rise with Professor Vahegurupal Singh Sidhu. Professor Sidhu is a leading thinker and writer and scholar and a full professor at NYU and has been at the forefront of thought and knowledge production on institutions and regionalism and so many other aspects. So Professor Sidhu, you are here with this group from NYU traveling across the country with the motto of the two worlds of India, and I was quite intrigued by the very theme that you had chosen, and you say it's both a leading power and a developing country. And some might say that's a contradiction, but we've had great powers or leading powers which are not necessarily very high per capita income also in the past. So I'd like to kickstart with you. You are an international relations scholar. There is this talk about India as a would-be great power or a great power in waiting, or as we call it here in the Narendra Modi era, it's the leading power or on its way to becoming leading power. You've all been witnessing the changes in this country and are seeing it firsthand. So could we start by discussing a little bit about this leading power idea, and where do you see, how far do you think India has come in this journey, and what will it take for us to get there in the big league along with China and the US, because ultimately that is what this whole journey is supposed to be, right? To be among the top 3 in the world. So your thoughts on this leading power journey and this and the prospects of India as a leading power?
Thank you very much for having us, and it's certainly a pleasure to be on this very reputed and exciting program. The way I would sort of present that is, if you look at the long sweep of history, and we look if you look at the pre-colonial era, I would argue that India at that point of time, along with China, was not only the world's biggest economy. Between the two of them, they had more than 60% of the global GDP, but they were also both rule shapers. You look at Buddhism emerging from India, for example, obviously other religions which emerged from here, but really these two countries were setting the rules for civilization going forward. Then we come to the colonial era, where both of these countries, and let's talk about India for a minute, was forced to become a rule taker. The rules were now being designed by others. And India had little or no say in that at all. In the independence or the post-colonial era, but also India's independence, you see India being both a rule taker, but also a rule breaker. So if you look, for example, at the UN Charter, India was one of the first signatories, was very willing to sign up to that. But when it came, for example, to the nuclear hierarchy, and other issues where India saw itself being constrained, it chose to break the rules. In the way in some ways to make it more relevant for the times. And now we've come to what I would argue is India trying to become a rule shaper again. So, leading power is one phrase, but I would probably say rule shaping is another way. Now, of course, when India is now emerging, it's emerging at a time of a multipolar world. And no single country has the power to make rules on its own. it will, so, and that's true of the United States and it's true of India. So India will really have to work with other countries to shape the rules. But let's be very clear. There are some areas where the rules, the global governance rules, are not going to be shaped without India's presence. And I can already think of at least 5 areas in that. Number 1, maritime. Number 2, trade. Number 3, climate. Number 4, outer space. And last but not the least, cyber or emerging technology. In all of these, you cannot envisage a global structure, global governance, without India in it. Now, this doesn't mean that India is not going to push back on some of these, and we've seen that happen as well. But I think that's an important element to sort of keep in mind, that India is now becoming a rule shaper. And I think the reason why that's happening is partly because of the domestic development ideas as well. So you're absolutely right. There have been many other major powers which have remained developing, or there have been internal challenges. But I think in the case of India, there's certainly so much more impetus because of the economy, because of its growth, that it's now serving, not only resolving itself, but contributing to the global economy, but also serving as a model to other countries to follow.
Well, that's substantive opening comments, Professor Sidhu. Let me just take you a little deeper on the rule shaping and the rule making aspect. I mean, obviously, it comes with more material heft. You are already talking about the economic, and of course, we are also third, fourth largest defense spender in the world, and we need to ramp up military spending as well to maintain the balance of power and all those things. But is that enough to shape rules to just be a big country in terms of size, and or do you think it also requires some innovative approaches? You mentioned all these regimes, for example, and I know on this trip you have also been visiting institutions within India, and I noted, I was happy to see that you've all been to the International Solar Alliance, and you've heard from them. That's just one example, and that's an institutional innovation that India can proudly say is our own creation. So, in terms of innovation and ideation, beyond just the material basis of rising and being seen as influential, do you think we are doing enough, and do you think there are areas among these 5 domains that you're talking about where we can come up with a brand new idea or an institution that can also have a great global impact and acceptability?
Right. So I would answer that question in 2 ways. So one, India is serving as a model for other countries, particularly those countries which are multicultural, multi-ethnic, and very, very diverse. And so, if India can do it, other countries can do it. We were just at the United Nations office this morning, and one of the things which was talked about was the Millennium Development Goals succeeded because of China. But if the Sustainable Development Goals are to succeed, it will be because of India. If India gets its act together, and that's going to be such a powerful message. That's one element, by example. But the point that you're raising, I think, is a really important one, and we see some of that happening in India, but not enough. You mentioned the International Solar Alliance. This is the first international institution, treaty-based institution, based in India. It's the first one out, I would argue, probably in this region or outside of Europe, where most of them are based. India needs to do more on that. This is obviously one very good example, but there are so many more that India needs to build up on as well, particularly because I think it has a very good story to tell on the climate, on the energy, and some of our amazing students had gone to the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, where they learnt a lot about how India is going to really beat its own target of net zero of 2070 by many years, and how that's going to happen. But I agree with you. I think India needs to play a bigger role on the global stage to call for and set up more of these institutions.
Okay, let's bring in our young friends from NYU, the students who've been seeing and experiencing India. Folks, some of you study economics and business, and already Professor Sidhu mentioned the fact that the high economic growth. India is approximately growing around 7% per annum, which is among the major economies. Among the G20, it's the fastest. And it looks like it's on a sustained path of growth. And we know, even going back to history, as Professor Sidhu was mentioning, there was a time when India was a dominant player in the global economy in the pre-colonial times. And like the Chinese, we may be returning to the big league through this, leapfrogging growth over the next, decade or two. So, from what you are seeing, I'd like you to come in and talk a little bit about the economy, the infrastructure modernization and growth that's happening in this country. If you had come about 10 years ago, it would be unrecognizable. Is that kind of, so while we have all the history and the heritage, and I know you've been to Agra and you're seeing those monuments, it's also the contemporary India that's quite stunning, the transformation. And if you just do a kind of like a mental map and say, in 10 years, if I come back in 2035, what would this country look like? And probably you will again have to scratch your memories as to what was here and what was there and how come this looks so different now. Anyone wants to come in about the economy and what you're seeing about economic growth, and if you're reading and studying about the Indian economy, and because that is the critical factor for its rise, and also as an example to other developing countries that Professor Sidhu is talking about. Would anyone want to come in on that?
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Matthews, and I am a graduate student at New York University. Thank you again so much for having us here today with you. I want to frame my response to this question around India's digital development. I believe that from what we've seen in our site visits so far, India has really positioned itself as a key leader in digital development, and that I think has contributed to their economic growth and will continue to do that. But I think more importantly, India is serving as a large example for how this can cut across different sectors, which we've also seen in our site visits, particularly within climate change, energy, and environment policies. But I think overall, India serves as a model to the rest of the developing world in how they have successfully transformed the nation through initiatives like Digital India, of course. But I think that it can just serve as a larger model for other parts of the world as well.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. I think this aspect of digital transformation is quite critical, as our young friend from NYU says, and there is an issue with the service sector, which is closely linked to digital and which is actually driving a lot of the growth. But we also need manufacturing in this country, and that's been one of the key pushes in the Modi era to try and rev up manufacturing, and this is called the Make in India initiative, to try and attract more foreign investment, to make it more business friendly, and these reforms are supposed to yield long-term dividends for sustained growth and for employment generation. Anyone else among the students want to come in on the economic transformation underway in India?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Gurpreet Kaur. I was born in India, but raised in US, and I'm studying at NYU. I'm doing masters in cybersecurity, global security and cybercrime. And on the economy aspect, I want to mention that I think globalization plays a big role in impacting India's economy. In terms of foreign investments, it gives Indian companies the opportunity to expand and explore. And also, I read that according to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, India contributes about 15% to the global growth, despite having challenges like poverty, inequality. And also in terms of technology, I want to mention that India is the global IT hub service provider too.
Hi, my name is Carolina. I'm originally from Brazil, and my take on India's economy is it's a really young country, if you think about it, since its opening in 91, and its development has really been impressive. And yeah, that's a lot about digital integration. Also, it's multilateralism between the countries, and just it's really impressive how India has been dealing with its diplomacy. And as Brazil, India is a developing country, and the Global South is really taking the lead in the next few years. We can see in the G20 and even in other initiatives as BRICS, for example, that they are assuming a leadership position that will definitely shape the world in the next years.
Thank you. So, viewers, our friend from Brazil who's studying at NYU is also talking about shaping global institutions. Again, that's an important point, the theme of this show. And the economic rise will also help to inspire other countries. Brazil is a big model among the developing countries. It's also a rising power in the Western Hemisphere. And the Indian model is also quite distinct here in Asia. And these kind of parallels are also quite helpful because Brazil has a higher income status and has developed quite a bit in the last few decades, and India also a fellow democracy, a large populous country like Brazil or even bigger, has its challenges. It's also a democracy, but it's growing. Let me bring in a little bit of the democracy aspect as well. I mean, you're all students of political science and related issue areas. The fact that India is a democracy has sometimes been seen as a hindrance because people compare it to China, and they say that it's a state driven growth and there's a command economy, and the one party state decides where to channel the resources, and that produces wealth creation in a more effective way than the chaos of Indian democracy. I mean, that's how it's often been presented. But democracy has its own strengths. You are studying in a US university. Do you think that factor also will matter going forward for India's rise and its impact on the world? Do you think India will be its leadership, for example, will be more accepted because it's a democracy? Or do you think that doesn't matter? I mean, sometimes people say, oh, everything is pragmatic and values don't matter. If you bring money to the table, if you invest and you lend like the Chinese are doing, you get influence, and it doesn't matter whether you're democratic or not. But the very fact that India is democratic, and as Professor Sidhu was saying, the fact that if hundreds of millions of people come out of poverty through this model, the Indian democratic model, that probably will set an example in the 21st century, right? Anyone wants to come in about the democracy aspect? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Ryan Dubois. I'm also an NYU student. I'm studying in the Executive Masters of Public Administration program with the Global Leaders track. And with regard to the question of democracy and economics in India, I think the numbers really show that the state-directed, more socialistic economic model that was dominant in the 20th century was not necessarily the most successful model for economic development. That after the economic liberalization of the 1990s, this is when you saw a great increase in economic growth. And I think that goes very much hand in hand with the politically democratic model, especially because India, not only historically but also contemporarily, is such a diverse country, ethnically, religiously, linguistically, and so I think the preservation of that social fabric is extremely important, not only for the sake of development, but also so that all sectors of society have equal access to that development. And I would also point out the fact that, we can look at China's successful economic development, but we can also look at the negative elements of the lack of democratic structure, such as what many would call a genocide against the Muslim Uyghur population. So I think, that balance of economic liberalization, which also, by the way, I should add, should be directed by the state, which is a very important regulator and also sometimes innovator in and of itself, coupled with political democracy and the maintenance of the social fabric, I think is very essential for the country.
Right, thank you. Our young friend from NYU viewers is saying that the state must play a steering hand and a role in India's economic growth and rise, but at the same time, it should not overplay its hand, and that's what we have seen in the Chinese case, which has led to like mass atrocities and such things in the name of development, in the name of modernization. So point well taken, and I think the Indian model ultimately may be slower, relatively speaking, than the Chinese breakneck speed of growth, but then we are expected to be catching up with them and be on par with the US and China in due time. So I suppose that will be the ultimate proof of this theory that democracy and high growth can coexist. There was a time when the so-called Asian values theory was dominant in East Asia, starting with Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew and then adopted by the Chinese, which said that people give up freedom and in return for bread. But if you can get bread and still live free, probably India will be after the United States, probably the only second democratic superpower in the world. So that's, I think, of great value, something we look up to. Okay, this group viewers from NYU has also been traveling and is going to different places across the country, including down south to Hyderabad and Bengaluru, and they are also visiting some very interesting centers of excellence in India in science, technology and innovation. And I want to take up the group on this. They are going to T-Hub in Hyderabad, the Center for Digital Public Infrastructure and the Indian Institute of Science in Bengaluru. Now these are actually role models for the world in terms of low cost innovations in different spheres and entrepreneurship, and actually it's a good place to take the visiting American students, because they can see the dynamism of India with their own eyes. And I want to take up the group on what impact this will have, as they think in terms of science and tech. You all must have seen the news about how India landed on the south side of the moon with an absolutely frugal space program with bare minimal costs, and these kinds of things have actually inspired a lot of people. Some of you spoke about digital, and there also our the digital finance, the fintech and the payment systems are being adopted in dozens of countries. So there are certain very unique things coming out of this country which don't require heavy overhead costs and capital outlays, and are still being quite influential and popular internationally, what we call the digital public goods. So you are visiting the Center for Digital Public Infrastructure. So let's talk about this aspect. Let me bring in Professor Sidhu on this matter. Professor Sidhu, people know about this so-called jugaad and India's ability to innovate at low cost and to fix problems, and that of course has been known, but we never scaled up and made it such a big phenomenon that it would impact the world. I mean, it was seen as, okay, Indians are successful individually, like a lot of them. We have a huge diaspora in the US, there are more than 4 million of them. Most of them have done well. But now we're talking about India right here being able to produce these global public goods, which are being adopted by other countries. And a lot of the G20 and also the rest of the developing countries seem to think that some of these, for example, the India stack has been spoken about, as one of our innovations. It can be used for e-governance and such things, for quicker distribution of welfare benefits. So this kind of fintech related innovation is something that you're also taking the students to see. So could you talk a little bit about this, and what is the impression that gives back home in the US and elsewhere in the world you think about India?
So I'm going to start with jugaad, and it's a phrase that a lot of the group here are very familiar with, and we've almost kind of lived it in some ways in some experiences as well. So jugaad is make do. Sort of making things work when they're not necessarily likely to work in the more effective way. My own sense is jugaad is good, but it only takes you so far, and you really need to now systematize things going forward. And that is a very important transition that you've seen. And I'm really grateful to Elizabeth for mentioning that in terms of the global digital public, the digital public infrastructure. This is, in many ways, we were talking about, rule shaping, is India's contribution to the world. Because until now, the concept was that really it's the private sector which is going to be setting up the digital infrastructure, but that has always been for profit. So there are parts, for example, of the United States which do not have access to digital capabilities, not because of the lack of technology, but because of the lack of economics. There aren't enough customers, and therefore companies will not set up cell towers, for example. But in the case of India, the sense that this is it's a public good, and therefore the government is willing to step in and create the public digital infrastructure so that everybody can use it and benefit, I think is a really remarkable contribution as well. We talked about the International Solar Alliance. I think there's something to be said for India wanting to perhaps build something similar at a global level. Why not have a global digital public infrastructure institution here? to talk about that as well. But I'm sure my colleagues here would want to talk about some of the jugaad aspect of it as well, but also in terms of the tech part of it too.
Right. Let me bring in students again. Technological innovation generally is associated with the richer countries and with advanced economies, because there's high capital investment and concentration in these places. But there are some areas where India is excelling, not everywhere, but there are pockets where we are really good and we are world class. So what do you think that tells you about this country, and where do you see the potential for this kind of tech innovation taking not only India forward, but also spreading the public goods, for the global consumption, because we have not given out the kind of loans and the heavy. We have not done the hardware and those sort of things as much as we are doing these softer and nimbler things, which are kind of like the extensions of our IT prowess, but now being scaled up. So anyone wants to come in on the technology and science and what you're seeing and what you expect from India and what you've heard?
Hello, my name is Hunter Hedman. I am one of the students at the Global Affairs Masters, and with a concentration in energy and environmental policy. One of the things that has really stood out that India is leading in is not only setting but meeting targets within the climate change ambitions. I think this is one of the spheres where India is really leading and innovating strongly. Some of these focuses by, looking at what has been already accomplished, meeting Paris Agreement targets, and already having, the net zero targets of 2070. One of the things that's really stood out is while India has yet to reach CO2 peak emissions, the ability to lower that and achieve net zero would be the fastest of any nation, especially within the major global economies. So how that's being done has been truly remarkable. When we look at infrastructure, the incorporation of renewable energy as a means of not being secondary, but a primary combination, and how its ability to include that has brought prices of energy down within the country has been truly remarkable. Additionally, as we see these goals for renewable energy to be implemented, you see that problem where the solution's coming from. We see EVs, we see solar panels increasing efficiency from 20% higher. This ability to increase storage, transmission is being done here in India, and I believe it will not be something that is solely stricken to just India, but will proliferate the rest of the world as they look to India for these innovations in renewable energy.
Thank you. So, viewers, sometimes people are skeptical and say, "Oh, we are a developing country, and we should look out for our own needs, and why should we be worried about helping the rest of the world?" But India's rise, our External Affairs Minister, Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, always says there is no contradiction between nationalism and internationalism in our case, and we have always tried to make sure that we share our prosperity or our ideas that can help others to also rise. So, in that sense, when we say multipolar world order and that's our goal, with India as one of the power center, it means that we also want another 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 more power centers to emerge. That can only happen through sharing, isn't it? So, yes, on climate, for example, as the students from NYU are saying, there is a great deal of frugal innovation that's happening, and that can potentially be lifesavers for the planet as a whole, especially large developing countries and poorer nations. So, let me also now switch a little bit from the public goods and the institutions to the power politics, because that's one area that's inevitable, and this group, most of them are studying international relations. So, let me bring in Professor Sidhu first on this matter. Professor Sidhu, we are usually gung-ho about India's rise here, and we often talk about how it is going to make the world more equitable, more balanced, more with the power more equitably distributed and all that. But it inevitably also raises the question of competition with rivals and potential, conflict or even war. I mean, as you know, the history of the rise of great powers has been laced with a lot of violent, adjustments. So, the real question is what happens with India's rise to the global balance of power and to power politics, you think? And is there potential for friction-free rise, and or will there be efforts to prevent India from rising? I mean, that's always something in the back of our minds, especially given our long-term rivalry with our next-door neighbor China. And we have, as you know, moved far beyond the Pakistan-India hyphenation, because Pakistan has been left behind economically and is really struggling. So increasingly the question is, can China accept India's rise, or will there be more conflict because it doesn't want us to catch up with them, you know, because of the zero-sum mentality? And many of us are quite negative about the possibility of China accommodating India's rise, you know, which means that there is, especially in the military and in the defense circles, there's a lot of talk about we have to be prepared for all eventualities, you know. If China thrusts war on us, we have to fight back, you know, that sort of narrative is there. Of course, we would like to avoid this because it's horrible for two big, Asian giants to go to war again. But the question really is India's rise going to generate that kind of, what current? You've written about the, China-India relations, and you've studied this closely. So if you branch out of India and look at the neighborhood and beyond, what is it looking like in terms of this country becoming more powerful, wealthier, more influential? What is the blowback or the reaction likely to be, and how do you see this growth in that broader regional context?
That's a very good question, and it's a very challenging one as well. I think we were discussing this in some of our visits as well. China began its reforms in the late 70s, some have argued, or definitely the early 80s, at a time where the relationship was much more benign. The globe was relatively more peaceful. And so China really in some ways got the peace dividend going forward. But when India chose to rise, on the one hand, it was the end of the Cold War. And so you see India benefiting from that initially. And it was quite a spectacular rise, although India was beginning obviously from a much lower base, as it were. But today, I would argue that there are three sort of fundamental challenges before I come to the China question. And I would present this as the three C's. One is conflict between the great powers, right? And we're already seeing interstate conflict now on three different continents. Second, we are also recovering from COVID. What that means is that the old model of globalization is gone. This sense of you get from everywhere else is something which is not going to be supported anymore. There's greater concern about actually having supply chain resilience, friendshoring, as it's being called, other elements of that as well. So I think that's another kind of element which is also going to constrain how India sort of grows as well. And then the last is climate. Look, let's be very clear. The rest of the developed world grew using and burning the dirtiest of fuels for centuries. The fact that the United Kingdom is now closing down its coal-fired power plant is good, but they've been doing that for the last 200 years. So India has those kind of constraints. But let me now turn to the issue of conflict. And I think vis-a-vis China in particular, I would say it's at three different levels. One is at the bilateral level, where of course you have the tensions over the border, but you also have bilateral trade, where even though China is India's largest trade partner, the trade deficit is certainly in China's benefit. Second, if you look at the regional scenario, particularly if you look at the China-Pakistan relationship, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, the fact that China has more investment in many of India's neighbors than India does is another kind of element as well. But I want to touch on the last one, which is at the global level. And at the global level, I think there are two sort of levels of competition. One is even as India steps in to wanting to play a greater role and responsibility at the global stage, it is definitely being tacitly challenged by China. China may not, and China can do this without necessarily supporting India's case for membership of the Security Council, for example, or of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which is another sort of instance and example that you can think of as well. Despite that, I think it is inevitable that India is going to be more and more recognized. Its membership of the G20. In BRICS, for example, is very, very interesting that you see, China acknowledging and India's presence there. And India's presence is also, contributed to a degree of legitimacy, both for BRICS, but also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But the third level of tension between China and India is in some ways a quasi competition for leadership of the global south.
Right.
India is not leading that, is not in that fight necessarily, but here are two competing models.
Yeah.
And I think that's again something which is worth thinking about, apart from the military dimension, which is one kind of aspect of that as well.
Right. Yeah, viewers, this is a multi-dimensional competition. Professor Sidhu is reminding us, and because we share the same geographical space, we also vie for influence in roughly the same part of the world, so which is mainly the Indo-Pacific or Asia, and that's also where I think it's inevitable to some extent, because these are two different models. If both China and India were democracies, or if both were authoritarian, maybe we could say that they might coexist, but here there is a problem. Let me bring in students on this aspect as well. You are all studying global politics. You are from NYU, a very reputed American university. The US-India strategic partnership has been growing, we say, from the outer space to the, netherworld, from, skies to the sea. US-India partnership is growing, and the China factor is very much, there, either upfront or behind the scenes, driving this strategic partnership. And already Professor Sidhu mentioned the great power competition between China and the US, and India becomes a very central and pivotal actor in that framework. So would anyone want to come in and talk about the US-India partnership, and given the competition with China for both these two big democracies, where we have a shared sense of threat or of concern with the way China has been behaving and growing? Anyone wants to come in on this aspect?
Hi, my name is Tanvi Joglicker. I'm from the Center of Global Affairs, and my concentration is around transnational security. I personally think that the rise of India is due to strategic autonomy as well as for stability. And what I mean by strategic autonomy is that India can have partnerships with the EU as well as Japan and the United States, but also have partners with controversial countries like Russia and Israel, which is truly amazing. I still don't know quite enough to wrap my head around it, but it's amazing that they can stay neutral in all of this. In terms of countering China's balance, India focuses on regional partnerships with the Quad allies, which focuses on the Indo-Pacific. And they should definitely continue, I believe, to use the Malabar exercise, which happens annually, into counter China's balance, as well as touch upon blue water capabilities. India should definitely increase their budget for naval presence in the Indian Ocean and around, because I personally think that China and America have a bigger size of fleets and technology. And lastly, I would like to add that they should also depend on their island friends like the Seychelles and Mauritius and Maldives, which are crucial for India. I know that in 2015 and in 2018, Prime Minister Modi did send some donor crafts over to help create awareness of countering China's balance, which I think he should continue to do. And finally, just the bottom line up front is that in order for Asia to balance power, India must see how the economy is growing as well as strengthening its military capabilities.
Yeah, thank you. That's a substantive response from our young friend. You're of Indian origin, I suppose. We have a large diaspora in the US, and they are also emerging as thought leaders, and we are very proud of them. What she's saying is also that there is this military balance, and that India needs to do more on defense in order to push back. And of course, partnerships are critical in the region, and the oceanic domain, the maritime spaces are of course the critical area, because those are the high seas which are not sovereign territory of anyone, and that's anyone can go in and show presence depending on their capabilities and their intent. So that's really where, unlike land, which is all divided up in the high seas, where really the competition will sustain. And in a way, it's going back to maybe 19th century, 18th century type of geopolitics, where maritime security was critical for empire and colonialism and for hegemony and all those things. So let me bring in some more voices on this aspect, China versus India, and where does the US come in, and what are you seeing about India in the US and the US-India partnership, and in particular, let's focus a little bit on that, and which are the areas you think are the most promising there, and what more we can do with the US, not only for the pushback of China, but more at the broader level for democracy in the world and for public goods. And there are many interesting ideas that the two sides have come up bilaterally to do joint works in third countries and in different regions of the world. It's called a comprehensive global strategic partnership, the US-India. And when we say global, it means that we are trying to shape rules and regimes, as Professor Sidhu was saying, but also whole regional orders, in a favorable way. So US-India partnership, where do you see it going, and what more can we do with the US? Yes, please.
So much for having us here. My name is Juan Salcedo. I'm a student at New York University, Center for Global Affairs. I think the US and India partnership is very crucial for both countries, and especially for countering Chinese influence, especially within the Pacific, especially through their partnership via the Quad. I think beyond that, I think its partnership is very important within both their economies. I think the US depends a lot on the Indian diaspora, especially to lead its tech sector, while India depends a lot on the US to supply high education for Indians in the US, and I think that that relationship should be continued and strengthened. I think that the US and India both present two similar but different models of democracy that can both be very inspiring to the developing world and the global South, that could be used as counters to the Chinese model and to the Chinese Belt and Road initiatives. I think U.S. and India relationship is a good model for the rest of the world.
Thank you. So viewers, there is a concept called the North-South-South cooperation. You heard of South-South cooperation, India cooperating with fellow developing countries. But if you bring in a richer country, let's say like the US, and we jointly do things in other developing countries, that's what we call a North-South-South model. And North-South-South, we not only do it with the US, even with Japan, for example, in the Indo-Pacific. India, Japan cooperate in many countries for public works and for healthcare and for education, lots of initiatives like that. So there is great potential in that, and our friends from the NYU are talking about that. And we will need a lot more of those sorts of collaborations for this global partnership to go forward. Let me bring us towards the end of the show and talk again at big picture and bring back Professor Sidhu on this matter. Professor Sidhu, India's rise, we, like the US, we have a sense of manifest destiny. We believe that, we are returning, as we have spoken, and that this is not the first time it's rising. But at the same time, like all developing countries, we have challenges, and during this trip, you're seeing that as well. But in balance, can we be optimistic that we will have that the pluses will override the minuses when it comes to India? We still have, issues at various levels with governance and with the states, and it's all very diverse. But still, great powers have risen with a sense of purpose and some kind of national will, and to some extent we are seeing that in the Modi era, last 10 years. But then, what going forward, you think we'll be able to? Do you see any potential threat or hurdle to India's rise, and how do you think we can overcome it?
Thank you again. Excellent questions. And the way I'll address that is maybe go back to the title of our trip. Leading power, but also developing country. And you asked by sort of saying, aren't there countries which have led without necessarily being fully developed? And you're absolutely right. But the difference here is, I think India is rising because it wants to develop and support its population, not the other way around. The rise is, a consequence of that. It's not the result of that. And I think everything that you see India doing is very much for its people. And that's a very important distinction. And I think, comes back to the issue of democracy that you talked about as well. Two of our students here are very much also concerned and looking at some of those issues at the domestic level, particularly in some ways about how much more empowerment can be done and given to women.
Yes.
In every spheres, and I know they'll talk a little bit about that as well, because they've been focusing on that, and particularly in this trip, it has become much clearer. So I think it, as long as India remains true to 2 or 3 objectives. Number one, to make sure that the well-being of all Indians is at the center of its objective, right? And number 2, the democratic part of it, which means, that you want to preserve the multicultural, multi-ethnic diversity which is there, but also, bringing up those segments of society which are not as well prominent, and particularly, in terms of gender equality, right? And again, I'm sure there'll be discussion. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well. I think those 2 are going to be very, very crucial. And the third, of course, is at the global level to follow the rule-based international order, which India is committed to doing because of the, its UN Charter. You see this in every way, shape, and form as well. And India also realizes that to rise or to grow internally, to address all the problems, it really needs to get global support. And that's where the multipolar world becomes really, really crucial. As I mentioned, some scholars have talked about there are 2 key challenges that India needs to address. One is, and I'll talk about this in the Sustainable Development Goals, is Sustainable Development Goal number 2, poverty, and Sustainable Development Goal 5, gender inequality.
Absolutely.
And those are the 2, I think, which are going to be really crucial. But I know there's a couple of students who might want to come in on that.
Students, you want to come in, especially on the aspect of women. During our G20 presidency, we had this women-led development as a paradigm, and we promoted women-led globalization, women-led development, these kinds of ideas. What are you seeing in this country? Undoubtedly, there are inequalities. How do you see us overcoming it? And clearly, 50% of the society, if they're empowered, I think this country will outpace even China in growth and become number 1 in the world. I agree with Professor Sidhu. Anyone? You want to come in on the women aspects? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Nadej Diedrich, and I'm studying global affairs at New York University. And to speak to the development and gender inequality, also to echo Professor Sidhu, since being here, I've seen that there's so much passion and talent and really that desire to uplift communities within India. And we met specifically and learned about the Delhi Commission for Women, which was really inspiring. And one thing that really stuck out to me was that they really were intentional and thoughtful at the way that they approach gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is, and with all these issues we're discussing, they're more than one layer. It's not just about getting justice, it's about also empowering the survivors. And in the Delhi Commission from Women, we learned, one thing that really stuck out to me was that they took a really comprehensive approach to healthcare. They extended on just beyond physical health, but also incorporated behavioral health by creating this initiative to have fleets of counselors on demand to go out to survivors, which is really empowering. And I think just using that as a model and thinking about all the different multi-layers to these issues and how we can kind of work to uplift and empower communities is so important for, other SDGs as well.
Great. Anyone else on the aspect of women and development and India's rise in that context? Yes, please.
Hello, thank you for having us. My name is Evelyn Hernandez. I am one of the students here at NYU studying human rights and international law. Coming here to India, exploring women's rights and seeing the women coming from different villages, sharing their stories, sharing their everyday lives, and seeing the way that they have advocated for themselves, seeing the way that they have tried to create more of an identity for themselves, opposed to one of them was really moving and saying that she is now identified herself and she is not known as her husband's wife, which was very empowering hearing that, knowing that it is 2025 and women are still being identified as someone else, but now that India is on a rise and they are creating more opportunities for women in leadership, it has been very inspiring seeing it, because coming from the United States and having those rights being given, seeing these women still advocating on a day-to-day is definitely eye-opener, and I can't wait to see where these women will be in 5 years from now.
There's an empowerment story viewers and involving Indian women. It's still incomplete, work in progress, but the American students who are coming and engaging with local institutions and organizations are able to see some change, and I think we'll have to make a massive effort to go to the next level. Concluding thoughts on your trip to India. Let me bring in students one last time. What is this? How is this trip transformed your understanding or thinking about India, or your impressions? Did you come with a certain set of assumptions, and has any of those assumptions been challenged or reversed or reconfirmed from what you've seen, what you've heard so far? How has this India trip been? Let's let our audiences know what American students are seeing and hearing and thinking about India after experiencing this country. Anyone?
So I think one of the primary impressions that I'll be taking away from my trip here is just how impressive so much of the social, political, and economic progress that's taking place really is. I think, we definitely arrived at the country with a pretty thorough understanding of what many of the challenges are, but to really see on the ground and meet and speak with the folks who are meeting those challenges in really tenacious and innovative ways has been very impressive. Some of those people have been mentioned by my classmates, women's empowerment and rights activists doing amazing work, those working on environmental sustainability and infrastructure goals, those working in issues of human rights and civil rights. So just really seeing the folks on the ground that are, meeting these challenges in really effective and innovative ways that are, not only anecdotally obvious, but also measurable by data, I think is really impressive. And I look forward to continuing to watch these trends unfold.
Wow, so it's not just all talk. Our friends believe that these things are also measurable, and the progress India is making in many fronts is not simply make-believe, but something that can also be collected in terms of data and something that can be studied scientifically. More views on India, what you're carrying, your impressions?
So I did grow up in Delhi for 2 years between 2007 and 2008, and I personally believe India has come a long way since then. I haven't visited India since 2015, so it really shows how cleanliness it is, as well as when we went to the Empowerment Foundation for Women's Rights. I was very moved by that, and seeing that India is helping women, which is truly amazing, and I'm very proud to be in India. Thank you.
Great. Any other last views on your impressions of India? Yes, please.
Well, I guess as last impressions, India's contemporary issues still have a long way to go, but they are developing in a really fast pace, and it's really impressive to be here and to see in first hand such a ancient society and civilization, and just to really get the insights from Indians' views and Indians' perspectives, and actually being here on the ground has changed my view on India in many aspects. I was hoping to find a parallel between India and Brazil, and I am still figuring that out, but I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, the parallel is, we are great democracies, great welfare states, yeah, and of course, we are also leaders in our respective regions and so much more. Professor Sidhu, last word, you are an old India hand, but you come back and whenever you see the changes, I mean, what does this, tell you about the process that is underway, at the big historical level? This century, sometimes people say is Asian century, and then more nationalistic people in India say it's going to be an Indian century because we should not be tagged along with China, we are different. So let's sum up the show by talking about this country's rise as you have seen it over the last decades. As a scholar, you've been studying and looking at it. How different is the India today from, say, when you began your career, 30 years or 30, 40 years ago, looking at this, the change, and any one big takeaway you think, which is a standout feature of India today compared to, say, the 1990s or the 2000s?
I mean, there are so many, but let me pick on one obvious one. I remember a time where India was so short of food grain that it was actually importing, and it was literally hand to mouth. I still remember growing up with milk, which was coming from the European Union as part of what was known as the Colombo Plan. Today, India is an exporter of food grain, of milk. There's a surplus. Just to give you one instance of how that is dramatically sort of changed as well. You talked about the diaspora. Some of them are here. Just to also see, how well established they are, how well recognized they are and appreciated they are in other parts of the world now as well, which is something which is happened over a period of time. And as I said, and maybe I'll conclude with that, if you look at those 5 areas that I talked about, you see that India has to be on the high table there, irrespective of the other geostrategic and other challenges which are ongoing, because it's recognized that India, despite the strategic autonomy, which is not comfortable for every country in the world, particularly the United States, there's a recognition that you still need to have India on your side, which is why there's a greater understanding of that logic of strategic autonomy, but also that in the long run, even though there may be fundamental differences between India and some of its partners, that India's rise is going to be beneficial for the global good.
Viewers, what a fascinating discussion with students and a scholar from New York University. The takeaway for me is that India's rise is beneficial to the international community at large, and a lot of countries want India on its side, and that's not just because of its size and its market, but also because of certain qualities it represents and the ideas it's bringing to the table, the institutions it is helping to launch or to co-create, and the problems that it is trying to solve on the broader global governance aspect. So, there's so much that India's rise is doing to maybe democratize the world, to make it more equitable, fairer, and also more rules based. So, in terms of the overall 21st century, if it is going to be an Indian century, I don't think many people need to worry about it. Rather, it should be welcomed. It's a responsible rise, and one which is, like Professor Sidhu is saying, within the realm of acceptability for most countries. So, in that sense, it's good news for the world, and our friends from NYU who have come and seen this country and are traveling across this great country are also realizing that there's so much more positive than perhaps negative if you are to balance the different dimensions and aspects of 21st century India. Thank you viewers for being with us on this special show, and thank you to our distinguished delegation from New York University. Have a great time in India, and we hope to see you again. Come back. Thank you so much.